This is Wendy Halley, and you're listening to Lucid Cafe. Hey, how's it going out there in podcast land? I hope you're doing well and enjoying life, which for many of us means ignoring the headlines. It's crazy town out there. So we escape into podcasts and other things. Well, today's episode is a bit of a departure from the subject matter the show typically explores, which means I have to pull out my unofficial tagline for the podcast, which is Lucid Cafe, a podcast about shit Wendy's interested in. All right, so let me set this up for you. I read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, and not too long ago, I discovered an author named Daryl Gregory, whose work, to me, manages to be unique, entertaining, and thought-provoking. Besides being really well written, the reason I'm drawn to his work is because he tackles topics that I find fascinating, like the nature of consciousness, free will, paranormal abilities, and the power of belief, specifically of the religious variety. And then when I learned that he doesn't really believe in the things that he writes about, I was intrigued. I thought, what a fun conversation it'd be to have someone like me, who has waking dreams and could be a character in one of his novels, talk with someone like him, whose worldview is anchored more in materialism. So I reached out to Daryl and asked him if he'd be up for coming on the show, and I was delighted when he said yes. And I'm so glad he did. It was a really fun conversation. He was incredibly kind and generous with his time. So let me tell you a little bit more about Daryl Gregory. He's very fancy. He's an award-winning writer of novels, comics, and television. His most recent books include the Appalachian horror novel Revelator, which was a Dragon and Locus Award finalist, and the novella The Album of Dr. Moreau, which was an Edgar Award finalist. His novel Spoonbenders was a Nebula, Locus, and World Fantasy Award finalist, and his novella We Are All Completely Fine won the World Fantasy and the Shirley Jackson Awards. The sci-fi novel Afterparty was an NPR and Kirkus Best Book of the Year and a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. His other novels are the Crawford-Award-winning Pandemonium, The Devil's Alphabet, Harrison Squared, and Raising Stony Mayhall. His short stories have been nominated for the Hugo and other awards, and many are collected in Unpossible and Other Stories, a publisher's weekly Best Book of the Year. He's also co-authored the comic book series Planet of the Apes and Dracula, the Company of Monsters. Daryl is an executive producer and writer for several of his novels being adapted for TV. He also teaches writing and is a regular instructor at the Viable Paradise Writing Workshop. Please enjoy my conversation with Daryl Gregory. Daryl, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really psyched to be talking with you.
Oh, thanks for having me, Wendy. This is I'm a little nervous, but I'm excited to have the conversation.
Well, yeah, I am excited too. Well, let me just say I am a member of the Daryl Gregory fan club now, that I have explored many of your books. And you're right, this is not, we had talked before we started recording that you are not a typical guest that I would have on my show, but my unofficial tagline for the show is shit that I'm interested in. So, so that means I can invite whoever I like on the show.
Great.
Plus, I'm hoping that this conversation will get people excited, maybe an audience that you haven't connected with yet, get them excited about checking out some of your work, or maybe all of your work.
Great.
Okay,
Yep.
so.
No, I'm always happy to find new readers.
Well, yeah, that is the nature of writing, right? Is you want people to read your stuff.
I am. I'm not a journal keeper that much, except when I'm brainstorming, but I don't keep like a chronological thing or a personal journal really. So I'm always sort of pointed outward, trying to explain myself to others. So that's sort of my default mindset.
Yeah, you mean like through your writing or?
Yeah, through fiction, like it's always me in there. So the hard part is like, how do you get readers to feel what you're feeling? How do you get to talk about the things that you want to talk about and still keep them entertained and turning the pages? So mixing those two things together, how do I do self-expression, but still I want to entertain people. I want to do the things to their heads that were done to me when I first became a reader. And I got that was always my first instinct, which is how do I do this myself? And I didn't understand why everybody didn't want to be a writer. I didn't understand that. Like, how could you not want to? Like, here we are.
Well, but that is very telling, right? So you're doing exactly what you should be doing, clearly.
Yes.
When was that moment that you realized this is what I want to do? Like, how far back in your life do you
Oh,
remember?
yeah. Like I said, I mean, my first novel was, what was it? 8 pages long, and I was in fourth grade. I just immediately did the cover. It broke it up into chapters, and the chapters are like half a page long. I mean,
That's adorable.
it's that. I mean, it's that early. It was sort of undeniable from that point on, and most people just outgrow it, and I just never did. So I kept writing, and I never knew if I could ever make a living at it, but I knew I wanted to keep doing it no matter what.
I know you probably are making a living at it now, yes?
Mostly, yeah. So
Mostly?
I still, I was for years, I was a technical writer, I was a programmer. And so I still do some programming on the side because writing income is up and down.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And that makes me sort of financially nervous. So and I also, I realized a thing, for years I was half-time programming, half-time writing. And then I went to full-time writing and my productivity did not double. In fact, it got worse. I wrote less when I was a full-time writer and I had no
Interesting.
way to do it. I was unfocused. I was spending too much time on Twitter. No, now at least that's become easier to stay off of completely. And then so I decided, oh, I've got extra bandwidth. I needed to structure my time to make myself more focused. And so it's worked out for me to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and reserve a block of time, like 4 hours a day, to just be a writer. And after 4 hours, I'm kind of useless.
But even that's a pretty disciplined practice. Reading other writers like Stephen King on writing or just their process and how much they can produce in a whole day. Like it's a job, an 8-hour job. Personally, I can't write that way. I mean, I'm probably more random than you are in that. I mean, I can only do like 2-hour chunks of time when I do any kind of writing. I-
Well,
because-
Stephen King is a machine designed to make other writers feel bad. So,
yes, he's done a great job at that. He always makes it sound so easy. All right, so you knew when you were really young, this is something I really like to do. So it was fiction too, right? I mean, you were drawn
oh,
to
yeah, it was totally
creating
fiction.
worlds.
And it was always the weird stuff. That seemed, I became an English major. I was actually, became an English theater double major, which makes me twice as unemployable as the usual liberal arts major. And but
Nice
um,
work.
I studied, I studied the canon and all that stuff, but it was always the weird stuff that I knew I had to write. That just sort of spoke to me. I mean, my stuff gets sold now kind of as sort of as mainstream fiction with weirdness added. But for me, the weirdness is always intrinsic to it. Like I like the idea of psychological realism in the face of surrealism, which is how my life feels. Sort of, it's like you're
I can
normal people
relate.
trying to make sense of things and who usually don't have the things that other characters in science fiction usually have. Like, I don't have many scientists. I don't have many really hyper competent people. They're usually normal people trying to get by in a weird world.
Yeah, no, and that's what's so inviting, I think, about it because it's completely relatable and your ability to create characters is brilliant. I mean, you paint a unique picture for each character that brings them to life. And I don't even know if I can find words to really
Those are pretty
capture
good
it.
words.
You like those words?
Yeah, those are good.
Yeah, I'll take those words. But But it really, I mean, it's a freaking gift. It really is.
For me, it's always character. I mean, characters are. I mean, there's different ways different novels get started, but characters always right there in the beginning with whatever the idea is. There's never been an idea I've had that didn't have somebody attached to it in my head that I wanted to write about. And so one thing I really like about writing is the focus of it. It feels like meditation in that I get to think about these other people and I get to listen to them. And I'm sounding more like your usual podcast guests in that I'm listening to voices, but for me, it's really clear that like it's a soothing kind of thing. Like I can tune into those people, and writing for me has always been a stress reliever. So whenever things are really frantic, having time alone just to be in my head with those people and trying to get the sentences right has always been soothing in a way that's almost feels like the way my partner talks about her meditation practice. Like that's what it's always been for me.
How extra cool is that, though? It's not only something that can help you pay the bills, but it's also something that sort of gives something back to you personally besides money.
Yeah. And I've been doing this for a long time. And for years, it was like the money is like $500 for a short story. So there was never any chance, I thought, for this to become actual money. But it was always about like, I just wanted to do that thing. And it was so pleasurable to be able to do it. And I had a really good partner, even though we were raising kids and our lives were really busy. And she was getting tenure. And I was working full time for most of the time. It was like a huge gift to be able to have time as a person who comes off like an extrovert, but is actually an introvert, to be able to sit by myself and do that thing.
Yeah, well said. I wonder if a lot of writers are introverts.
It seems like most of them are. When I go to conferences, I say it's sometimes like going to a convention for hermit crabs. Like we've all brought our little shells with us and we sort of hang out together in the bar and talk, and then we quickly retreat.
Because I'd never even thought about that before. I was just assuming the reason why my books don't do well is because I'm really shitty at marketing and because I'm an introvert. But if everyone, if everyone's like that, then
And marketing is so terrible, and it doesn't play to the strengths of most writers I know. There's some people who are very gifted marketers who are very good at building, lots
platform,
of platform and tons of communication with their readers. I really admire those people, but it's always been hard for me. And so I've been lucky in writing a style of fiction that other people publish. Other people can do the marketing stuff, and I can, I'll do whatever they ask me to do. And I love going out on tour. As a theater guy, I can put on that extroversion and perform while I'm reading on tour or doing things. But really, I just prefer to stay home and keep writing.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And and it helps me feel less alone. That's great. So acting, that's an interesting passion too, yeah? Or is that something you
Yeah,
still
and I
pursue,
had to
or?
sort of give it up. There was a certain point when I realized I'd much rather be rejected through the mail than be rejected in person as an actor.
Yeah, that is easier, I imagine. Yeah.
And I could do it, and I could do writing totally on my own. I didn't have to find a group of people or get the funding or all that kind of stuff that has to happen. I mean, I love collaboration, and when I work in comics or TV, there's a lot more collaboration. But yeah, mostly I enjoy the part of just being by myself. But the interesting thing for me is most of the things I rely on as a writer come from acting and directing stuff that I learned in college and in high school, not from literary criticism or anything like that. So for me, like where the character stuff comes from is thinking moment by moment, what do these people want from each other? Beat by beat, even in the scene, like, oh, they just felt rejected, so they're going to try something else. Those are all very actorly kind of things. And so I'm always trying to act my way through the scene and always trying to keep the focus on what do they want from the other people? So forget
That's clever.
explanation,
Yeah, I
whatever
like
weird
that.
science fiction is going on, but what are you trying to get? And Mike Nichols, the great director, said there's only three kinds of scenes. There's either fights, negotiations, or seductions. And so sometimes I always think to myself, okay, is this a negotiation? If so, what are they trading? Are they just trying to hurt each other? Or is it a seduction? And a seduction doesn't always have to be sexual. Sometimes it's just trying to win somebody over to your side. So they're using the tools of whatever they have available in the scene, their own information, and sometimes it is exposition to sort of win people over. I love writing that kind of stuff. And if I don't know what people want, I can't write the scene. It becomes useless dialogue that just goes back and forth and doesn't go anywhere. And that's the editing job, to pull that back out and go, oh, Daryl, you haven't figured it out yet.
That makes perfect sense. Makes
Yeah.
perfect sense. It seems like a no-brainer, right? But then I don't know if anyone who pursues writing intuitively goes in that direction.
Well, no, it's the thing about writing, you come at it from the outside, like in the same way you would watch television. You can see what's happening, you enjoy it, but it's harder to learn the tricks that'll say, wait, you can't just, my feeling when I first started writing was like, oh, they start on page 1 and they just continue all the way to the end. And it's exactly the same the way I read it. They just knew all this stuff. And for me, writing is really fluid. So I write the first chapter, I rewrite it, I write the second chapter, I go back. If I jump ahead, I always have to go back again and true everything up. And I'm constantly editing throughout the novel. I just finished a novel and turned it in. And I was still, up till yesterday, right before I click send, fixing sentences, trying to connect the beginning of the novel to the end of the novel. Because John Gardner said something where he said, the end of the novel should ring chimes that echo all the way through the novel. So get your last line to echo what you started with. It can make the reader, all of a sudden it sort of sends a chime and makes the reader feel like, oh, everything was connected.
I love that. Well, and it makes, again, perfect sense. But it's interesting, though, if you're writing that, again, those, I don't know, maybe I'm just reflecting more of myself, that kind of linear fashion of, all right, this is where the story's going. How do I get there? Rather than the negotiation pieces that have to happen. All right, so I want to dive into a little bit of some of the topics you choose to write about, which is fascinating because, I mean, well, first of all, genre-wise, you've been classified as sci-fi and fantasy, yeah?
Yeah.
But it's not, like you were saying earlier, it's not the traditional fantasy sci-fi. It's more, I guess you'd say, I don't know, everyday.
Right. Mainstream. Some people could call it, well, it's genre is such a tricky thing because sometimes genre is a label to put on it. So they tell you where to go in the bookstore, or a label that tells you you don't have to go to the other parts of the bookstore. This is where your home is. Other times genre is, from the writer's point of view, what books am I in conversation with? What book is this book in conversation with? So what tradition am I drawing through that I'm commenting on, that I want to add to and flesh out and make my own? And other times, genre is just a marketing thing. The same book could be marketed under one genre or another genre. It could be marketed as, here's a mainstream book for people who hate science fiction, but it's secretly science fiction. Or here's a science fiction book with a bunch of character stuff that, by tradition, or more from a point of view of bias who don't read science fiction, think that can't be part of science fiction. One thing that happened when a novel of mine, Spoonbenders, about a family of psychics growing up in Chicago, it got marketed as mainstream, and a lot of people interviewing me read only realistic fiction. And so they said, well, look, it seems like you've transcended science fiction. And I'm like, no, I haven't. This is actually science fiction. But sometimes the word transcendent gets used as code for, I don't usually like science fiction, but I like this. So it can't actually be science fiction. I'm like, no, it really is. But there's a tremendous breadth in the field of character-based stuff, of beautiful writing. I think there is still sort of a, inside science fiction, we call it the ghetto, that like there's a prejudice against it, that it's only about rocket ships and that
Right.
people need not apply. But for me, that's never been the case of who I read or the kind of stuff I wanted to write. Because like I said, the weird has always been important to me.
I can drink to that. So as you were saying all that, I was thinking that what I wanted to say about your style and that I couldn't find the word for before is accessible.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah?
I have a mom rule.
A
So
mom
the
rule?
mom rule is my mom, who passed on this year. I used to tell people that my goal was to write these novels that no matter how weird it was, my mom, who was not a science fiction reader, could understand everything and understand all the people and why they were doing what they were doing. And so accessibility is one of the things I was always had my eye on, which is I want both things. I want the cool idea or the really interesting point of view that comes from learning about stuff that comes out of science or comes out of a spiritual tradition, and have characters you can understand and follow with. And that's your way into the world. A lot of times I pick really normal people who aren't the experts because they're our window into whatever weirdness I want to talk about.
No, it's a really cool approach. And again, very accessible. It's like I can relate to this. And and so it's for anyone listening and who hasn't read any of your books, it's not what you would think when you would think about the typical genres, the stereotypes of
Right. And like there's
fantasy or sci-fi.
I mean, as a therapist, like one of the books that is weirdly accessible, which sounds like it shouldn't be, is a book I wrote called We Are All Completely Fine, which is about a bunch of people who have all experienced things that characters in horror movies have experienced, but they've all experienced different things, but they're all now in group therapy together. And what saves them is learning to connect with each other and realizing their story isn't over. In fact, that all their stories are interconnected, not just on a plot level, but also emotionally. Their main problem is not being able to trust other people and learning through the therapeutic process. This is where having a partner who's a psychologist really helps, because she sort of hands me the Bible, Irving Yalom's Bible for group therapy, and read that. And she
It's a
hands me,
classic, yep.
yep, yep. And Irving Yalom actually wrote fiction too. I read a couple of his novels. But yeah, I always feel like it's through people. That's the way in through the weirdness, not from the outside.
Right, and that's what I was going to say too, is that, I mean, you're not just telling these really cool, fun stories. There's always some sort of deeper thread there that you're exploring around bigger questions.
Yeah, and there's some things that have always bothered me that I keep coming circling back to: the nature of consciousness, the nature of free will. How is it that we can trust each other? And also, I grew up Southern Baptist, raised by Southerners. I grew up in Chicago, but they moved north for jobs in the 60s, and I grew up in Chicago. And so, even though I'm not religious now, all of that stuff I spent a lot of my time thinking about, and I still think about a ton, which is, what are the parts of my tradition that I can still connect to? What do I have to set aside? But I'm still really fascinated by the religious impulse. I wrote a book called Afterparty, which is based on a bunch of science I was reading, where using things like transcranial magnets, you can sort of evoke feelings of there's someone else in the room. And whatever the culture is of the person experiencing it will interpret it differently. Some Asian clients interpreted it as the ancestors are there. I can sort of sense them. Some people felt it was like spirits, they could feel their presence. And so I got really interested in that, and the way that both Catholic nuns and Buddhist monks, when they meditate deeply and they're inside an MRI machine, they're lighting up the same areas of their brain. So the debate in Afterparty is, okay, let's say there's this part of your brain that lights up in that way. Does that mean it's an illusion from the brain, or does that mean that's an antenna that's lighting up? And so the characters are having this debate, and I love those kind of questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, those are questions that are ones that I've been asking myself about my own experiences and have been wrestling with quite a bit. Just to give you a little background, a clinically trained psychotherapist. I was not raised in a particularly religious family, but my folks put me in Catholic school, so I went through all of the rites of passage that they have, or whatever the sacraments, I guess they're called.
Yeah, and the catechism. I'm not Catholic, but yeah.
Yeah, all of that stuff. And I remember when I was in seventh grade, so I would have been 12. I had gotten really sick and was thinking about a lot of things. And while listening to Beethoven's Sixth Symphony over and over again, just a weird kid, still am. And kind of thinking about all of this stuff and experiences that I had and ways that I was made to feel bad about myself in the church and not connecting to the things that they were talking about, not relating to it at all, and not understanding what they were asking me to do, how it related to anything, and none of it made sense anyway. So I came to the conclusion that there was no God. And I guess when I came to that conclusion, story goes, I came home from school, and at the dinner table, I asked my parents if they would please put me into public school next year because I said there is no God and I don't want to do this anymore.
This is
And they,
seventh grade. That's
yeah,
true.
and they said, okay. Maybe because they didn't want to pay the tuition anymore or whatever, but they were cool with it.
I think lots of church, we went to church a lot, evangelical Baptist. And so I think it made me a writer because you sat there and I would get so bored, but they would let me keep a notebook. And so I would just fill the notebook. And they were fine. They were fine with that. I was quiet. I wasn't bothering anybody. And so, yeah, it kind of made me a writer.
That's very cool. I wouldn't have thought of writing while sitting through those masses. So I got interested in psychology, and it was all neurochemistry. Like, how does the brain create our experience? And then I ended up going to graduate school for psychology, and it was like 2.5 years out of, or not even out of graduate school, I started having these spontaneous visionary experiences that I didn't tell anybody about except for my current lovely husband because I was embarrassed. I was definitely awake, but I was definitely having these visionary experiences, and they were dreams, but they were very linear, they were hyper real and super engaging, very interesting to me. And
Did you
I
feel a sense of connection? Was that bound up in some of these? When I read about feelings of the numinous, a lot of times there's this feeling of like, oh, everything's making sense. I'm connected to things.
I
No.
didn't necessarily feel connected. I felt like I was a witness. I was watching these things
Oh,
happen. Yeah. There were some where I was, well, like the very first one, I was inside the body of a woman who was being executed in the
oof.
electric chair. I know. So I was like, I wasn't her, but I was like a hitchhiker in her experience. It was crazy. And then I had subsequent ones that were also death related, where I was watching it from the outside, and then I could also be on the inside of the person having the experience. All kinds of stuff opened up after that happened. I just kind of tucked those experiences away as just sort of these anomalous, weird waking dreams. I didn't know what to put
Sure.
them in as far as a category. And then I started studying this thing called shamanism, and I was learning how to access this dreaming state intentionally because I didn't even know what shamanism was. I just felt like I'm going to do this. It was a really weird impulse. I'm just going to do it. When I started learning it and having these experiences, everything started to make sense in a way that life hadn't made sense before. And I was changing in response to these experiences. Like I was becoming a better version of myself, is the best way to put it. So, anyway, I am by definition delusional,
Right.
right? Ask your partner.
Yeah.
But I'm really high functioning. And so I have this foot in two different worlds. And for years, for a long time, I was embarrassed about it. And I would only access this place on behalf of others under the radar. And I just always said, well, if people keep coming to have me dream on their behalf and it helps them, then I'll keep doing it. If people stop coming, then I won't do it anymore. And people still keep coming. so so it's like having to wrestle with the idea of consciousness, like what is it that I'm experiencing? Am I making this all up? Is it just a neurological experience that I'm having, or is it something beyond that I can't understand? So that is my very long-winded story as to my own personal kind of struggles with the things that you're wrestling with in your books. And some of
Yeah.
it, yeah.
I mean, I think that's such a common well, it's not, I guess it's not that common, but it does seem like, especially when you're a kid, I would have, you have these experiences, weird neurological things going on. And I thought I was the only person who had this experience. And I started talking to other people, the little big feeling, like you're in your bed and suddenly you feel very, very tiny. And then you feel as big as the world. And then you feel really, really tiny. And I thought I was the only person in the world to experience that. And then I kept finding other people who also had that happen. And so you're wondering, yeah, you're always wondering, like, okay, so what's happening neurologically, and is there something out there external? Yeah, and I think everybody's coming to different kinds of answers about that stuff. I mean, my default is always toward the neurological, looking at neurochemical stuff, which is why I'm really interested in using psilocybin therapeutically. I think the research on that is really interesting. We were talking about that before we started recording. I find that stuff really fascinating because my default is that for me, I go there first for an explanation before I go to something external, because especially I'm wary of really specific explanations that came out of my culture. So growing up evangelical, any kind of weird thing like that has a religious context. There's a reason, there's a certain silo of why things happen that I grew up in my culture. And then stuff that's outside of it could be labeled as just the devil, or it could be labeled as angels, like, but there was always this labeling going on that had to stay inside the cultural context. And so I'm like, well, if this shows up in all cultures and every culture and religion is coming up with different explanations, a different framework to sort of organize and understand things, well, I come up from this evolutionary point of view that, like, well, maybe the way our brains are constructed would explain that kind of stuff, and we're all looking for explanations for why that's true. But that's the bias I come from. But I'm tremendously interested in that. And when I'm writing, I always write from a point of empathy, which is I try to give the strongest arguments against the reductionist point of view to the best characters. Like give the point of view that people argue with my characters, give that to the best characters in the book, the most noblest characters, give them the strongest arguments possible, because fiction that's just polemical is boring. And
Indeed.
it's also not true to humanity. It doesn't feel satisfying. So that's the way I go about writing stuff.
And are you working out these questions through your characters? Is that kind of how I don't know if it's intentional or not, but do you think that's what's going on with you?
Oh yeah, I think I'm in every character and on every page, because what choice do they have? They're all coming out of me.
Yeah.
So, and what you do is you pick parts of yourself or parts of other people that you're responding to, and either exaggerating them or saying, well, let's take the book we were talking about, like We're All Completely Fine. Each of the people in that circle, all those patients, I have parts of me that's in there. So there's somebody in there who's very cynical. I'll take the most cynical parts of myself and I'll give him the cynical lines. I'll give the misanthrope every misanthropic thought I've had. I'll give him that stuff, and hopefully there's the therapist in there is the most pleasant, and I'll give her all the empathy I feel as much as possible. So you're just trying as best you can. I do think I'm like George Saunders, who said he's a better person on the page than he is in real life. I have more empathy.
Ouch.
The book I finished is my whole rule was empathy for every single character. No villains, just get inside the head of everyone and see things from their point of view.
That's the one you're working
the
on
new
now?
book I just sold, it won't be out for a couple of years the way publishing works, but that's a book about a bunch of basically pilgrims who are in a very odd world where we all learned about 7 years ago that we were living in a simulation, but it feels exactly like this world feels to us. And then nothing changed except for they knew they were in a simulation. So then they're all wondering, does this change anything about being a human? Like, let's say we're made out of zeros and ones instead of being made out of a cloud of quarks on the subatomic level. Does that change anything? Isn't love the same love we would feel no matter what we're made out of? Isn't
Mm.
pain the same pain? And there's religious people on the bus. There's a bus going across the country. There's religious people on the bus who are wondering, well, what's our relationship to God? If there's a creator who created this subworld, is there a God on top of that, which is a very Gnostic kind of idea of demiurges and in-between gods? So I just sort of said, let's forget the Matrix, or let's be in response to the Matrix, which is in every movie about a simulation, there's the whole point is we figure out we're living in a simulation. It's, oh my goodness, can you believe it? Let's put that aside and say, we figured that out 7 years ago. Now what do we do? How do we deal with this world where nothing really has changed, but everything has changed? And the hard thing about that book was just reining it in. I could go for 1,000 pages with those characters, and
Really?
every single character on the bus gets their own point of view chapters. So it's a sprawling book that I had to contain by putting them on a bus.
Well done.
But that's a little weird to say to your listeners, because that's a book that won't be coming out for a while. But that's basically the process, which is every time I had a chapter, I would open it up, try to figure out who I was with that character on the bus.
All right. So I'm trying to guess whether or not are you struggling with empathy in your life, or are you just joking about that?
No, well, the older I get, the easier it gets. I think the problem with empathy is, where do you draw the circle? So one good thing about being a parent of small children and raising the family is it focuses your attention and saying, look, I know what my number one job is. We've got to get through this. We started out pretty broke. We're raising these kids. We both have busy jobs, and you kind of know what your job is. And then you expand the circle, like, well, who else do we need to take care of? Your extended family. How far does the circle go? I think it was Obama's aunt who said, if everybody's in the family, nobody's in the family. And so you're like, well, so where do you draw that circle? And then I was living in California for a while, in Oakland. The homeless population's expanding. So then you're always feeling kind of guilty that you're not doing enough. And then the planet is burning up, right? Like, well, if I'm thinking about my grandchildren who don't exist yet, why am I writing a novel? Shouldn't I just be working on climate things all the time? Or shouldn't I sell all my stuff, become a monk sort of, and like give away all my stuff and like only work with the homeless? So we draw these lines, and you're trying to protect your sense of self to sort of feel good about yourself. But that's sort of a story you're telling yourself, that you tell yourself a lot of times the story that I'm doing all I can do. And a lot of people don't have a job like you, where you are actively saying, look, I'm going to go into healing. My whole job is going to be about helping other people. I've got this kind of selfish job where I mostly want to sit by myself and write. So I'm obviously not working on the bigger problems of humanity. I'm sort of working them out for myself on the page and then hoping other people read it. But that's a selfish act. So I'm always thinking about those things.
I'll say yes, but I mean, as you're working things out on the page, just in your own mind, do you have any kind of hope that your readers will be inspired to think about similar things and come to their own conclusions, obviously? But I mean, because you're not addressing light topics. It's not like bubblegum novel writing. There's a lot of depth there, and it's inviting people, I think, to think about things in ways that they haven't. And to me, that's a gift too that you're offering to readers, right?
Yeah, you hope that you're asking questions that make people think. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that you can get people to change their minds through fiction. I think there's a lot of selection bias. And what's the name of the bias where you
Confirmation?
You basically reinforce your own biases by you find what you want and what you're reading and seeing.
Huh.
So I hope so. I don't know. The one case where I do think books make a huge difference, and they did for me, and I've seen this with my own children, is like books at a certain age really shape you and open you up to possibilities that maybe you're not getting in your own home, or they can find you at the right moment and sort of crack you open. And I think adults are harder sells, right? I think it's
But
hard to
we're
break.
pretty, yeah, we are really married to our narratives that we have.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think I'll challenge you a little bit
Yeah,
on that
please do.
because I think story is everything. I mean, that is how we have, I mean, it's been a big part of our evolution, I think, since we created language, ways to communicate. That's how we learned is through story, and how we communicated stuff is through story. And so
Mhm.
I love the idea that story, even as an adult, I can say that for myself, even as an adult, that my mind has been opened in ways that either through story on the screen, the little screen or the big screen, or fiction or memoir or whatever, somebody's experience has kind of cracked me open and maybe helped me to see something that I wasn't seeing before. And to me, everything begins with thought as far as how you're defining your reality and your experience of reality. So if your thought gets cracked open a little bit, your belief system gets cracked open, which is even more profound,
Right.
so that other ideas can slip in there and start to transform it. I think that is how change happens, is because I'm so fascinated by what creates change. Because I'm in
Right.
the business of that, right? As a psychotherapist, doing the crazy healing work that I do. Like, what is it that actually incites change? And I would have to say, and this is just me, talk therapy is limited in actually creating change, or I'm a really shitty therapist. But it also, it's a great support, but it's not effective, is what I would say. But it's when you have, like when I do this shamanic healing work, because it's bypassing the conscious mind and it's going right to the narratives that are playing out within someone at that unconscious level, the narratives that are playing out repeatedly for decades that make someone stuck.
Right.
It's
Right.
in and transforming that narrative in a symbolic fashion. I'll suggest the level of consciousness that that's where this work is being done, that it's changing consciousness. That's a loaded statement I'm making, and I can't back it up.
No, that's okay.
But then if there's sustained change as a result of that experience, then that will tell me that, maybe there's something to this, right? So that work is really about narrative and story. So it's the old story and then replacing the old story with a different story that's hopefully actually more authentic to them rather than the bullshit they were believing about themselves. Does that make sense?
No, I think that's absolutely true. I think the whole reason we've generated this idea of a self is to sort of manage a story. And when the story is really destructive, yeah, I think it just tears people apart, and you have to find a new story. I've met narcissists who are telling themselves a self-serving story that where they are the constant hero, and you're thinking you're living a story that no one else is believing from the outside.
And they won't give
So
that story up.
no,
That's
because
that story will
they're
be given
tied
up.
to
Yeah.
that story, and that's key to their well-being. Like they do not want to give up that story or make
Mhm.
themselves open to the possibility that the story could be wrong. I think that's always a challenge too. It's like when the story's working for you, like why would you give this up? A friend of mine spent years studying perfectionism.
Huh.
Yes, a psychologist, and he said he was a perfectionist, and he said the thing that kept coming up in all the interviews and
He would probably never be successful at that.
yeah, if he wasn't a perfectionist. And so he goes, people don't want to give it up because that's their edge, even when they know that could lead to behaviors that maybe aren't helpful to them. They always felt like it was their edge.
hmm
That's what made them better at their job, but better at what they wanted to do. And so you can get into a state. I love the concept, and I'm always thinking about this as a writer of it's a psychological concept of secondary gain. So you're like, okay, you're doing something destructive, but you're getting something from it that maybe you're not even aware of. You're in this
Absolutely.
relationship that's terrible for you, but you're getting something from it. What are you getting from it? And so whenever I have characters, and like I said, I'm the most empathetic when I'm writing, like, what are they getting from it? And what am I getting from, what are my assumptions? And so even if I don't know if my writing is helping other people, I'm glad if there are people like you who read my stuff and get something from it, but I know it's helping me. I know it's my therapy.
Yeah.
I know it's helping me think through stuff and challenge my assumptions and sort of keep questioning myself. And for me, talk therapy has helped me most when couples counseling, really helpful to let both of us have a space to say things to each other in sort of a mediated environment, so we
Absolutely, yeah.
where and my family doesn't talk about anything, and so I
Not
need a prompt. I need
right.
someone to shove me forward and say, you have to talk. And
Yeah.
then the story that I'd be telling is, if I say this out loud, it will be hurtful or whatever, and we'll never get past it. So I'll hold
Yep.
on, I will solve it on my own. That's been my problem. So therapy helps me to say it and realize, oh, you didn't die.
Yeah. You're going to be okay. Yeah,
You're gonna
absolutely.
be okay. And the person heard it and they're okay too. So
Hmm.
like, oh, the story I was telling that was destructive was, I better solve this on my own because no one's going to understand it. I better take care of this on my own. So one of the themes in my writing all the time, because it's my main issue, is, oh, how do you trust people? How do you open up enough to let people in? Yeah, but I tend to
It's a
come back.
great fucking question.
Really.
Yeah, I mean, the trust thing, that's a real core foundational piece that all of us struggle with in some form or fashion. And maybe that's a lot of why your stuff is so relatable, because you are kind of touching on that probably in every book that you're writing in some way, because it's
Yeah.
you struggle with, and we all do.
No, I think so. And I was lucky in that I didn't have a destructive family like friends of mine have had, but I still have these issues. So like, and one thing I learned from having children is that they come out with certain factory settings. So everybody's also got their own wiring that they come out with, that they
Yeah,
have to deal with their entire life. So I'm just fascinated by all that stuff.
it is fascinating. Absolutely. I'm going to dive into consciousness a little bit more if you can indulge
Yeah.
me. Raising Stony Mayhall. All right. So let me just little side trip here. When I saw the title of that book, I wanted to send the guy who was my literary agent some years ago a note and saying, see, someone who's fancy, his agent, and then finally editor and publisher was okay with having a title that was gerundial. Because I have this book called Slaying the Mouse, and he made me change the title because he didn't like that it was gerundial.
What did he want it to change to? Or what did you change
I
it to?
I changed it to Dreamtime Warrior instead, but
Okay.
then the book deal he was working on didn't work out, so I ended up just publishing it myself and changed it back to Slaying the Mouse.
Well, here's what I learned from just before we get into the book, I will say about titles. One thing I learned from having that book translated to other languages is that if you have a pun in English, it won't translate. So that book, real quickly for your listeners, is about basically taking the zombie story. What if Dawn of the Living Dead was a documentary and not a movie, and the zombie apocalypse is over, but there's one last living dead boy left, and so I had this idea of raising Stony Mayhall. Stoney's the main character, and I had this sort of pun of like raising him up from a child, but also raising from the dead. I thought that was very clever. Doesn't translate at all in any of every single version of that has a different
Okay,
title.
that's
Yeah,
hilarious.
my
All
favorite was
right.
it just came out in Spain last year as The Life and Miracles of Stony Mayhall, which is Life and Miracles of is sort of how they label all the saints books from Catholicism,
Hilarious.
like The Life and Miracles of Saint whoever. And so they put Stony Mayhall in, and I'm like, I should have done that title. So and not have it be a gerund.
That's brilliant. Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, so I was wondering if the whole zombie story was inspired by David Chalmers and the zombie question
Yes,
around
I'm glad you brought
consciousness.
that up. Yeah, so I've been following David Chalmers for years. My first exposure, this is embarrassing, was I went to a writer's workshop, and I with a woman who was dating him early on.
No kidding.
Back in the 80s. And I was like, who's this David Chalmers guy? But the hard questions keep coming up in my fiction. So David Chalmers says the hard question of consciousness is, why do we have it? Like, how do we even define this? And his zombie hypothesis was like this question in philosophy of, couldn't we have all the cognition we're currently doing of navigating the world, picking up a coffee cup, even talking to other people, yet not be conscious? Like, why do we have consciousness, awareness, and qualia, the feeling of what a thought feels like, or the feeling of what the color red, when you think of the color red, the sort of feeling that comes with it? Why do we have that? Why is it necessary? And so I wrote a short story called Second Person Present Tense, in which you can take a drug and basically invoke the zombie, and you keep walking and talking and meeting with people, but you're not there. And then when the drug wears off, you come back to yourself and you realize you've had an entire night of doing things and talking, and no one knows that you weren't conscious, but you were not conscious during it. And in second person present tense, she does an overdose of the drug, and when she wakes up, a new personality has booted into her body, and she has all the memories of her previous life, but she feels like a completely new person who happens to own this body and knows that those people are the parents of the people of the girl whose body she's in. And I thought I made all this up, and then I got a letter from a guy who said, this happened to me. I was in a motorcycle accident.
What?
And when I woke up, he said, I knew it wasn't amnesia. I felt like a different person. And the woman who was my mother, he goes, I knew she wasn't my mother, didn't feel like it. She goes, over time now, I really think of her like a mother. She's become really important to me. But he had no emotional connection to that previous self, and he was a new self in that body, which was crazy spooky. And he said, I know this sounds crazy, because sometimes I do get letters from people who think that whatever weird thing I just wrote about is that I really believe all of it's true, and they believe it too. But this guy, he's a professor at a university in Tennessee, and
it
actually happened. He had this motorcycle accident.
He had a TBI, I imagine, of some sort, right?
Yeah, exactly. And he said, he goes, the problem is that I wasn't as brave as your main character. I hid it from everybody. Like, pretended to be the other person, and pretended to.
Oh, that must have been horrible.
Friends with my friends. Oh, I know. It doesn't sound just hellish. Like, you're supposed to be acting a certain way,
and you're not that person. You're just not that person. Oh my God. It sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, but I think also that's a common thing in the human condition. I had a person wrote to me who'd grown up gay in the South and said, that was my modus operandi all through growing up.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The other person.
Oh, that's a great example.
Straight as my friend, but I will. And it wasn't until they actually graduated from college and moved away that they felt like, okay,
now I can be myself.
Let my guard down and actually be more of myself.
Mm-hmm. But the idea of being an identity and having relationships and then losing all of that and being somebody else, like that over a 24-hour period, like,
yeah,
that's nuts.
Yeah. So I'm really, so back to your original question is like, yeah, the thoughts about consciousness, Stony Mayhall is a good zombie. He's a conscious zombie, and he knows that his being a zombie is deeply weird and violates rules of physics. And he also doesn't know what the state of his soul is, and he's very worried about it. He doesn't know why he's conscious if he has no neurons to fire. And he spends the whole book covering his entire life and sort of and also violating the rules of physics. He grows. He sort of latches on, he attaches to a kid next door and grows at the same rate as that kid next door.
Which is a fascinating technique that you use. Yeah.
Right. Well, I wanted him to grow up, and I thought, no one's going to believe this. No one's going to follow me here. But I had reviewers point out this, like, well, this is kind of the way we all grow up. Like, you sort of look around, you sort of pattern match to try to figure out who you should be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You follow that.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole idea of what was really striking me when I was reading that book was, where does consciousness emerge from? And like you were exploring this, like it doesn't necessarily have to emerge from physicality. if what is going on with Stoney and the other cast of characters he ends up connecting with later, the
Well,
other
this is what I love
zombies.
about writing is that even if I don't believe in it, let's say I can write about, I have a novel about a family that worships their own private god in Appalachia. Even if I don't believe that actually exists, I'm really interested in saying, okay, let's take that as ground truth and go from there. Like, what would that do to your head? And then, but the natural metaphors for how we all get through life come in, because as soon as you think deeply, you realize, oh, this is similar to this thing I have felt, or this is what, this is similar to how I felt in these other situations. And so find a connection that way.
Let me just ask you one final light question. So
Yeah.
at this point, when you die, that's it? Nothing?
Uh, for me, I think that's it. I think everything else is, I don't believe the other stories. And so, and my sisters who are very religious, I like that you think this is a light question. My sisters who are very religious are kind of appalled by this. But for me, it's all about connections with other folks while we're here. One thing I was thinking about when writing this new book was like, we're all on the bus. Like the first job is to take care of everybody on the bus. Like
Yep.
when the bus breaks down, we got to take care of each other. And maybe that's enough meaning. Maybe I don't need immortality to make my life meaningful. Maybe we're just supposed to take care of each other.
That's a lovely note to end on. In all forms of the word end.
Right. Well, I appreciate this conversation because I know I'm more on the probably the more materialist and skeptical end of the spectrum, but I really appreciate the conversation.
Good, I'm glad. Well, I mean, I'm married to a highly skeptical, one of the smartest people I've ever encountered, who is open to the possibility that the stuff that I experience is happening and there's some legitimacy to it, but he can't experience it himself. So therefore he's like, yeah, I need the evidence.
I like how you
But
called him on one of your podcasts your emotional support Viking. I think
yes, yes,
that's
he
awesome.
is my emotional support Viking, very much so, and my very best friend ever. But despite that, I mean, he's a misanthrope, but he's also loves connecting with dear friends and family. It's
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I mean, he's just not happy with the human race in general, which I get. We're not very
Yeah,
highly evolved.
we're not firing on all cylinders. Well, actually, the problem is we're firing too many cylinders and cooking the planet. So maybe we could fire on a few less cylinders.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I think, or we need to all start taking more psilocybin or something to help us continue our evolutionary process.
Right?
And I'm looking forward to reading the next book, the bus book.
The bus book. Yeah, it's the title is When We Were Real. It'll be coming out from Simon and Schuster. Who knows? A little while.
Yeah, nice. Thank you so much, Daryl. This has been really fun. I've enjoyed the conversation very much.
Thanks so much, Money. I have too.
I think it's fair to say that we covered a lot of ground. Hopefully the conversation was as interesting to you as it was to me. A huge thank you to Daryl for indulging me and coming on the show. If you'd like to learn more about Daryl and his work, please check out his website, darylgregory.com. All right, thank you so much for listening and for supporting the podcast in whatever way you can, by giving it a positive review, which really, really helps, by letting others know about the show. You can make a donation of any amount, or by checking out the offerings at the Lucid Path Etsy shop. I hope the rest of your day is incredible. Until next time.